Hello students, we are going to continue on in our chapter 5 lesson 4 notes, and this is the last part of our notes, declaring independence, and we're looking at the Declaration of Independence title here. So you'll notice that most of this here has asterisks next to it and it's in red on my screen, which means that we're not specifically going to take information from the textbook, but it does talk a little bit about some of the things in the text. So I am going to read a little bit before we answer our questions. So I'm going to start under the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration has 4 major sections. The preamble or introduction states that people who wish to form a new country should explain their reasons for doing so. The next 2 sections of the Declaration list the rights that the colonists believe they should have and their complaints against Great Britain. The final section proclaims the existence of a new nation. Now, I'm going to pause there for a second and point out to you here that we have the preamble, we have Declaration of Natural Rights, we have a list of grievances, and then we have the Resolution of Independence. Those are the 4 major parts of the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to continue to read. John Adams expected the day that Congress voted on Lee's resolution for independence to be celebrated as a national holiday. He wrote, "The second day of July, 1776 ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other." Instead, July 4th, the date that the delegates actually adopted the Declaration of Independence, is celebrated as Independence Day. The Declaration of Independence states what Jefferson and many Americans thought were universal principles. That is, principles that apply to all people in all situations. It begins by describing what had been long viewed as English basic rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration states that government exists to protect these rights. If government fails, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. The document goes on to list grievances against the king and parliament. These include cutting off our trade with all parts of the world and imposing taxes on us without our consent. Americans had petitioned for redress of these grievances. The British had ignored or rejected these petitions. And we're going to go on and finish out this section here. Finally, the Declaration announces America's new status. Pledging to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, the Americans declared themselves a new nation. The struggle for independence, the American Revolution, had begun. Now, again, we of course already know that the American Revolutionary War had already begun, but here they're making it completely official. They are trying to break away from Great Britain. So we're going to go back here now and look at this information. And from where does a government get its power? And our answer for this is from the people. We are the ones who tell our government what to do in a representative government. And that's what we have. And that's what they wanted in the 13 colonies, okay? So our 4 major parts of the Declaration of Independence we had listed, again, our preamble, Declaration of Natural Rights, list of grievances, and a resolution of independence, okay? Now, on the document itself, which I've showed you, it does not have those specific titles listed out, but it is kind of broken up into those 4 different categories as you read the document. Now, we're not going to specifically read the document because, of course, it's written in kind of like an old English sort of language. So there's a lot of translation that has to go on in that document. And so I am going to kind of paraphrase a lot of this information for you already. And we're not going to look at every single piece of information that is in the document. Okay, I'm picking out some highlights that I want you to focus on. So first of all, what is the meaning of preamble? What does this part of the Declaration do for Americans? And so what it is an introduction to explain why they're forming a new country. So they feel like they owe that explanation because this document that they're writing is not just for them, right? It's not only for Great Britain either, but it's really for the world to see and for them to understand why the Americans want to form a new country. It's not just because they want to, but they feel like they're sort of being forced into creating a country separate from Great Britain. I want to quick just mention too this word preamble. We're going to see it again when we learn about the Constitution, and that if you look up that word preamble in the dictionary, you will see here, and it's highlighted, that it's also known as just an introduction, typically to a formal document, such as the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution. So this is what preamble means, is an introduction. So that word could be used in place of the word introduction, okay? So our next part of the Declaration of Independence is the Declaration of Natural Rights. So we've talked a little bit about natural rights before with John Locke. We talked about that earlier in the year. And then again, John Locke came up in this lesson as well, in lesson 4 information. And so I did not have you write what those specific rights were then, because they're a little bit different than what John Locke said were our natural rights. So these natural rights, they claim are what our nation was founded on, and that is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they call these unalienable rights. And that was mentioned down here in this primary source. And these are words that are in the Constitution, that we're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And then it has there in those little brackets that means rights that cannot be denied. Okay, so if somebody tries to take your life, your liberty, which is your freedom, or your pursuit of happiness, then there are consequences that go along with that. And now, one thing that I want to make clear to you, that the words pursuit of are very important when we list out these rights. It cannot simply be life, liberty, and happiness, because you cannot be guaranteed happiness. No one can guarantee you happiness. But what we can guarantee you as a government is that you are allowed to pursue things that may make you happy. Now, when you achieve them, you may find that it doesn't make you happy. So you can't go back to the government and be like, you said I was going to be happy. That's not the way that it works. So the beauty is that if when you achieve that goal and it doesn't make you happy, now you can go and try to find something else that makes you happy. The government can't stop you from trying to pursue your dreams unless it involves illegal activity, okay? There are definitely boundary lines when we're talking about rights that we have in this country. And our next category is the list of grievances. And grievances, we've, I think, had this word before, is complaints. It's another word for complaints. So this part of the Declaration of Independence is the largest part, of course, and it has 27 complaints against Parliament and the King. And it specifically lists out all of these things that they see as the Parliament and the King doing wrong against the Americans, against the 13 colonies. And we're going to talk about those coming up here in this lesson. And then we have the last part of the Declaration of Independence, and as that is the resolution of independence. Okay, so they're going to resolve something here at the end, and they are going to make their statement of separation. Okay, and so what that means is they are announcing here that they are now an independent nation, and they now also have a new name, and that is the United States of America. Now, I'm going to ask you, we are going to have an assignment on the Declaration of Independence, and you are also going to have this information on your summative that will be coming up. So I am going to ask you to tell me the 4 parts of the Declaration of Independence, and they must be listed, first of all, in order, okay, of the way that they come in the document, and they also have to be listed as you see them here, the way that they're called here. Now, if you, again, if you were to Google this information and you said, what are the 4 parts of the Declaration of Independence? It may look a little bit different depending on what Google search you do. Because, like I said already, these are not specific titles that are in the Declaration of Independence, but this is how we refer to them. And it depends on who's teaching it on what they actually call those sections. Aside from preamble, which should be the first answer for every single one that you try to like Google search. Otherwise, they may call parts 2, 3, and 4 something a little bit differently, but you are going to have to use these terms in order to answer that question correctly. I wanted to come back here again and show you an image of the Declaration of Independence and how I mentioned before that it's sort of written in one sort of like large block. And so the preamble is obviously going to come right here at the beginning, right? This is our introduction. And you see that line kind of right there? That's about where the introduction is going to leave off, basically. And then it's going to go into the natural rights that we have here. And you'll see these lines every so often. That doesn't mean it's a new section because then there'd be way more than 4, right? Way more than 4 parts. So we start with the preamble and then it goes into part number 2, which is the Declaration of Natural Rights, that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And then the bulk of the document is going to have those 27 complaints, which is the list of grievances. That's part 3 that's going to come next. And then you'll see here an indentation, right? So this is kind of like a new paragraph down here. This is going to be our resolution of independence, which has our statement of separation in it. And then down below is where we have all of our signatures. Okay, so we don't count the signatures as part of the document itself. So we don't say like that's the 5th part of the document. We focus on the content of the document. So that's why we have those 4 parts: preamble, Declaration of Natural Rights, the list of grievances, and the resolution of independence. Okay, so I wanted to come back and show you that document one more time so that you could see what it looks like. And now we're going to go back again to our notes. Going to leave that there for about another 30 seconds in case you need to get any of that information in your notes. And then we're going to move on to the next part of the notes, which is actually the last part of our notes. And this part is going to focus on section number 3, or part number 3 of the Declaration of Independence, which is the list of grievances, the 27 complaints against Parliament and the King. As I mentioned, we're not going to talk about all 27 of them, but we're going to talk about half of them. So we have 13 complaints against Parliament and the King that we are going to paraphrase from the original wording of the document, which I am paraphrasing for you, okay? So we're going to move forward here to list some of the grievances that are given in the 3rd part of the Declaration of Independence. So these do go in order of the way that they come in the Declaration of Independence, but they're not like, I didn't pick the first 13. I went through and picked out 13, and I tried to pick the ones that we have already talked about in class so that they, are recognizable to you so that you're like, oh yeah, I remember talking about that, okay? So our first one is a very obvious one, and that is that the Parliament has passed unfair laws in the 13 colonies. So I'll give you the information, I'll pause a little bit, and then I'll move forward. For some of my students who can type a little bit faster, some of these I have more to say about than others. So I'll try to figure out a good pace for you. So number 2 is they disbanded colonial legislatures. So remember that a legislature is the group of representatives who make laws in the colony. And so to disband them means that they broke them apart. So the Parliament would not allow colonies to have their legislatures to make laws or to create taxes within the colonies. Okay, they sent soldiers to occupy the colonies during peacetime. Our biggest example of sending soldiers to occupy colonies during peacetime is, well, we have two major examples actually, and we're kind of going to talk about it again in another one because they sort of are, they get kind of repetitive here, but they're really trying to drive home a point of these things that are being done wrong. So one example is after the French and Indian War, there were in peacetime, right? And they created that proclamation of 1763. And in order to enforce that proclamation, the king sent 10,000 British soldiers to patrol basically the Appalachian Mountains so people would not move west past them. And then we also have the Quartering Act, which again is one of the answers a little bit further down. So I'll wait to talk more about Quartering Act when we get to that. Number 4, they put limits on trade through the Navigation Acts, which ensured that only England would benefit from trade. And that's almost exactly what the Navigation Acts were. They said that you were only allowed to trade with Great Britain because Great Britain wanted to be the one to get the revenue. They wanted to be the ones who got the profit from any of that trade, any of the resources in the 13 colonies. Number 5, this is a major one, and that is they gave them no voice in Parliament. They would not give them representatives in Parliament, and this is going to our no taxation without representation, right? That was their slogan. And so they said, if we don't have representatives in Parliament, you can't give us laws because you're not seeing anything from our perspective. You don't know what it's like to be here in the 13 colonies. Now, number 6 goes together with this as well. So we're going to specifically put here that they taxed without representation. Oh, let me see. Can I move that over a little bit? There we go. Setting taxes without our consent. So even though, again, these go together, they put them as two separate things, as we don't have representatives in Parliament. And then secondly, you are taxing us without our consent. So there could have been other ways that they got consent from the colonies by sending it to the colonial legislatures and saying, you guys vote on it here. How do you think that should go? But then again, remember up at number 2, they disbanded the colonial legislatures. Okay, so every single one of these is going to be connected back to something in some way. And they're just really trying to drive home this point of all of these things that Great Britain and the king have done wrong against them. Number 7, they prevented expansion of the colonies through the proclamation of 1763. So I mentioned that one already, that went along with the soldiers that they sent. But this one is specifically talking about not allowing them to expand, not allowing them to move past the mountains, not anything about the soldiers themselves that they talked about up above. So this is just the fact that they made this law saying that you cannot move west of the Appalachian Mountains. They wanted to expand the colonies. I'm going to go ahead and leave this here for a minute, just in case you need to get caught up. Okay, and we're going to go on to our next page here, and number 8. They forced us to house soldiers through the Quartering Act. So once again, I mentioned this already, and the Quartering Act actually was part of the Coercive Acts, which was also known as the Intolerable Acts, and that it said soldiers would be stationed in the colonies and they needed a place to stay, and colonists had to allow them to stay in their homes or in their barns or on their property. And then they also had to provide beverages and bedding and candles for these soldiers. So they had to quarter them. They had living quarters that they had to prepare for them. And that's why it's called the Quartering Act. Number 9. They waged war against us. Okay? Great Britain decided that they were going to fight the Americans, and that's something that they see as wrong. They tried to, put out that olive branch petition, right? Try to get that one last chance of peace, and the king refused to even read it and decided to prepare for war. Number 10, they attacked our ships, our coastlines, and our towns. So, of course, we're talking about during the battles themselves now is what's happening. And in fact, the next two, numbers 9, 10, 11, and 12, are all about things that happened during the fighting itself, during the battles of the war. So attack our ships, our coastlines, and our towns. 11, he hired mercenary soldiers to fight us. And mercenary soldiers are assassins. And we talked about these assassins earlier on. And there actually were German soldiers called Hessians. And they were simply hired to come in and fight with the British. So, like Germany itself didn't enter into the war to help Great Britain. Great Britain hired them to come and fight. So they're hired killers, basically. They have no stake in the war. They don't care if Great Britain wins or not. They show up for the paycheck. And number 12, again, having to do with war, that he created a civil war within the colonies by making colonists take sides between patriots and loyalists and fight against each other. And again, this was part of our lessons already, that we said that this was not just a war between Great Britain and the Americans. It was a civil war within the colonies. It split families. It split friends. It split neighbors. I had mentioned once before that Benjamin Franklin and his son were on opposite sides of the war. And Benjamin Franklin was the patriot and his son was the loyalist. And lastly, this is kind of a big one. And this, I feel like, is more of a jab at the king than it is an actual complaint. So you'll see what I mean here in a second. And this one I used almost the same words as is in the actual document. So we have petitioned the king to correct these injustices, but he has not done so. A ruler who treats his subjects in such a manner is a tyrant who is not fit to rule. And again, I mentioned up before that they attempted to, ask the king to not fight against them with that olive branch petition, and that he just ignored it. And so they're saying, they're calling him a name, right? That he's a tyrant. He's not fit to be a ruler. So this is really kind of a jab at the king, and that they're saying, like, well, we've tried to do our part. We've tried to make things better, but you just won't bend at all. And so basically you've left us no choice in this situation but to break away and create our own nation. So once again, I'm going to leave that there for a minute so that you can finish getting that information.